Let me welcome you all to this second panel of the dialogue, this one on immigration. And I'd first like to endorse the significance that both Jack and Park have applied to transgovernmentalism and subnationalism. And I just want to make a personal remark. In the late 70s, I really cut my academic teeth on looking at the relationship between the Canadian provinces, which is why I was in Guelph, and the US states, working cooperatively on energy issues and on climate change issues, but also looking at them as international actors on trade promotion and reverse investment, where they were much more competitors, actually, rather than cooperative partners. So I think, we see these two aspects. Well, academics were very fickle, and that whole area of transgovernmentalism and subnationalism dissipated. But of course, practitioners were much more steadfast and kept up with the issue and practiced it, as we saw in the first panel. So I'm very gratified that practitioners stayed with it. And what's interesting is, of course, is that now academics are coming back to the subject. I think because they can't ignore the reality of what practitioners are doing. So this panel is on immigration, and the topic of immigration and immigration reform, of course, is a key element on the political agenda in both Germany and the US. But in both countries, it has been mired in party political and legal wrangling. And I would refer you to a piece on the front page of the Washington Post yesterday about the challenges to President Obama's proposals. But the reality that immigration activists and even the DHS are still gearing up for the changes that they believe will eventually come, despite the legal moratorium that we now face. Now, while national debates continue, local communities and regions are in the front line of addressing the challenges of immigration and the very real daily needs of immigrants. We cannot forget the human faces. It's not just a policy problem, we're talking about people. This panel addresses the importance of immigration for three different types of political units beyond the federal level in the United States and Germany. We are interested in how city and state officials respond to the immigration challenge through integration programs, for example, in the fields of education, employment, and in the area of legal status. We're interested also in the implications of federal immigration reform for localities. We have an illustrious panel with far-reaching experience on immigration issues, immigration and integration issues, because the two things obviously go hand in hand. You have their detailed bios, but I would like to say a few words about each of the speakers. Our first speaker will be Raquel Castañeda Lopez. She is a Detroit City Council member representing District 6, home to the majority of the city's immigrants. So she has a really in the trenches perspective. She is the first Latina ever to serve in this position. She is a social worker by training and has extensive experience developing and implementing innovative youth programming for marginalized communities. And I think this focus on youth is something that's going to come up in all three of our speakers. Raquel Castañeda Lopez founded and currently co-directs Detroit's Immigration Task Force. Let me just mention also the bios of the other two so that I don't keep getting up and interfering with the flow. Dr. Walter Kindermann is General Director for Integration Affairs at the Ministry of Social Affairs and Integration in the federal state of Hessen in Germany. He has many years' experience as a practitioner and a researcher, mounting drug addiction and rehabilitation programs and dealing with health issues more generally. He has also focused on challenges confronting youth. Walter Kindermann holds a PhD in psychology. And our third speaker, Cordula Simon, is the Officer for European and International Affairs in the Berlin district of Neukölln, which has one of the highest percentages of immigrants in the city. She has worked in the City Council of Berlin-Neukölln in different departments, including youth issues again. In her current position, Cordula Simon is responsible for the inclusion of Roma. She also writes on the topics of her practical work. We've asked the panelists to speak for no more than 10 minutes, as in the format of the first panel, so there's a lot of time for discussion. But maybe as they begin their presentations, perhaps they can suggest the composition of the immigrants that they deal with, where the immigrant populations come from, so we can see the diversity of the topic. But let me welcome all of you, and let me thank particularly our three speakers. Thank you very much. So first, Raquel.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Raquel Castañeda Lopez. I'm the Detroit City Council. As it was stated, I represent District 6, which is home to the largest concentration of immigrants in the city of Detroit. And just to give you a little bit of background on the current context and situation in the city of Detroit, I think Detroit is a city that's often covered in the media around the world, and you get many different stories, often negative, unfortunately, and often, I would say, pretty dramatic and untrue. So Detroit is not the first city that you think of in the United States when you think of immigrants and immigration. The immigrant population in the city of Detroit is relatively small, under 10%, and it doesn't have the same diversity as other parts of our country. The majority of immigrants in the city of Detroit proper, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference between the communities in the city of Detroit versus Southeast Michigan and versus the state as a whole, because it's slightly different. So within the city of Detroit, the largest immigrant population is Mexican. It is slowly changing to have more Caribbean immigrants as well as Arab American. Detroit borders Dearborn, which is the city that has the highest concentration of Arab Americans in the entire country. So whereas the largest population of Arab Americans live in the state of California, the highest concentration is just in Dearborn, which borders the area I represent, Detroit. So in District 6, we have Latinos, primarily Mexicans, growing population of Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Dominicans, Central Americans, primarily from El Salvador and Honduras, and then a small growing Yemeni community, which is different than some of the Arab communities that you'll find in Dearborn and other parts of Southeast Michigan as a whole. Now, for the region, Southeast Michigan, meaning Detroit, Metro Detroit and its surrounding suburbs, the demographic of the immigrant community is very different. I think the highest population are Chinese, then we have Indian. There's actually a decent-sized population of German immigrants living in that community. So kind of Southeast Asia, Far East Asia, and then some Eastern European countries. And the reason kind of for that shift, if we think of back into the 1920s and 30s, when Detroit was really at its peak around 3.5 million in population, many people flocked to the city to participate in the automobile industry. And so the kind of first wave of immigrants, many people came up from the south, a lot of Eastern Europeans, so you can drive through the city and still see the Hungarian club where it once was, a lot of Polish, Italian, and slowly as they moved up the economic ladder, it began to leave the city, and then newer waves of immigrants. So the Latino immigrant community in Detroit is relatively new and still relatively small. So I was only elected in 2013, not that long ago. I'm the first Latina as well as the first person on council to have an immigrant background. So I was born and raised in the United States, and my grandparents are from Mexico, and my dad migrated from Mexico. And so to bring that perspective to the table was something very new for the city of Detroit. So the demographics for the city is a majority minority city. It's primarily African American, about 90% African American. And the district I represent is 40% Latino, 40% African American, and about 20% Caucasian. And no other part of the city do you find that demographic breakdown in terms of different ethnicities. So when I got elected, I founded the Immigration Task Force with a colleague to really focus on developing a comprehensive approach to deal with immigration in the city of Detroit. The state is working on an immigration strategy that really focuses much more on economic development. I think many people can speak to that same kind of interest. When we talk about immigration, it's often in whether you're talking about it in this criminalized way, or you're talking about the economic viability and potential of attracting immigrants to a community and their investment power. We wanted to shift the conversation away from criminalizing certain communities within the immigrant community, as well as moving beyond just talking about individuals' value being based on their economic potential to consume and to contribute. So with the Immigration Task Force, there's 5 subcommittees. One does focus on economic development, but we wanted to have, again, a broader focus. One focuses on social services and education. Another component focuses on immigrant rights. Another focuses on marketing and community engagement. And then another on repopulation. And the reason for having kind of 5 key areas, again, was to acknowledge that when you're attracting people to a city, they're not just coming in, they're not just going to be working in a job and then that's it. There's many other aspects that go into encouraging people to settle in that area. So Detroit, we lost quite a few people. We are looking to attract residents to the city of Detroit. Attracting immigrants is part of that strategy. So how do you create a welcoming environment in a city that is very racially segregated? And as we transition kind of from this post-industrial city into whatever we will be in the 20, 30 years in the future, how do you welcome new people into the city, both immigrants as well as American citizens, while keeping the population still there? So a lot of the immigrants we have tend to be poor. They aren't necessarily from the BRIC countries where we want to have economic relationships and attract people from. So there are a significant and growing number of Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees and Jamaican, not refugees, but different asylees and people from the Caribbean. So not necessarily the people that you think of if we're very honest about who we want to attract to our country and attract to our communities. And a large percentage of Detroiters live in poverty, low high school graduation rates. So it's a lot of different challenges to work on. What we're trying to do is it's in terms of municipal services, and then kind of work down there to the very grassroots level of immigrant integration. And we see our work kind of in phases. One is improving how we, phase 1 is how do we improve our service delivery to the existing immigrant communities. Phase 2 is really about integration. How do we then integrate you, not assimilation, but integrate you so that the welcoming community, meaning non-immigrants, understand the value that you bring to their communities, and vice versa. What can you learn from that kind of a welcoming community? And the third phase focuses really then on building international relations. And oftentimes when we think of immigration, we don't think of international relations, but if you think of immigrants, they're just, visitors that are staying a very long time, right? And so it's important to make sure that you're viewing that as an international relationship, and how do you foster those conversations? So really quickly, I know I talk fast, but I only have 2 minutes left. So in terms of...
You can talk a little bit longer and slower.
Oh, it's a longer and slower, okay. In terms of municipal services, as a council member, what we're trying to do, surprisingly enough, we don't have a comprehensive language accessibility plan. So many of our documents are not translated. This is an issue, especially right now, because we're doing quite a few water shutoffs. Some of you may have read about that. And the notices are only in English. And when I discovered this, I said, we need to stop. What are we doing? Not everyone can communicate effectively in that language. So it's kind of, to a certain extent, and the city of Detroit, because the community is small, raising the level of consciousness that there are people that have different needs. That doesn't mean that that's a burden. We should see it as an opportunity. How can we improve our city services for the immigrant and non-immigrant community so that, again, people feel like they're able to access city services better? So we're working on a comprehensive language accessibility plan, really just getting baseline data that we've never had in the city about who speaks what languages, what departments need their information translated, how do we then contract to provide translation services. And the other long-term component, which I'm excited about, is how do we change our application processes to really incentivize people who are multilingual and have cultural sensitivity skills, and prioritizing and compensating them financially for those skill sets, which are often, I think, devalued. As well, so that's one component of municipal services. We will also be working to create a municipal ID, and some of you may have heard of this. New York has a really great model. Essentially what it is an ID that can be used within the city to access different city services. New York's model is great in that if you have this ID, you can use the library, you can go to different museums, you can use public transit. And it doesn't just target immigrant communities, it also helps senior citizens, kids who are under the age of 18 that may not have an ID. It helps both residents who are immigrants who are here legally as well as illegally. So I didn't mention this earlier, but when we work on immigration within the Immigration Task Force, we don't distinguish between illegal and legal immigrants. If you're an immigrant here, we don't ask people their status. Whether you have papers or not, you're someone that's here, that's participating in the society and using the resources. So how do we modify to make sure that we're, again, servicing everybody to overall improve quality of life for individuals living in the city of Detroit? So municipal services, language access, municipal IDs, and then really just creating a welcoming kind of culture. And I keep saying that we're part of a national initiative called Welcoming America. And a lot of, I think the power that local municipalities have is about creating this welcoming atmosphere. Because at the federal level, we could have comprehensive immigration reform. But if people are entering into communities and still feel discriminated against and still are unable to, I guess, kind of express their culture and feel welcome into schools, into jobs, they're not going to be staying in those communities. And so if we see immigration as an opportunity for Detroit to regrow our population, to increase the number of businesses and diversify our economic industries, then we need to not just look at the first piece of immigration reform and helping people to get here, but what's the next step after that? And so many foreign investors that I talk to, in students that come over, it's okay, great, so where can I get a job? We'll connect them to the job. The next question is, where can I send my kids to school, and where can I buy a house? And so if you have communities, again, that aren't welcoming to diverse populations, that's a conversation I think that really needs to happen at the local level, and we as local municipalities have the most power to engage in those smaller conversations, whereas the federal government I just can't do that as effectively. So there's lots more, but we'll save it for later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For the same message, I would need 30 minutes, I think. That brings me to the point I think I first have to remind you of a story. About 80 years ago, Thomas Mann came to the States, and his editor organized a big party for him. And after all the nice words about Thomas Mann answered, and he said about his editor, he's not only an editor, but also a creature. But what he wanted to say was a creator. What I want to say, if I should say something you think really stupid and silly, imagine it could be the point that English is not my native language, and ask back, maybe. I think I speak for you too. It's our point. We have to bring our messages in simple words, and because we don't manage so much words. You know, men don't have so much words in every language, and in the foreign language it's even worse. But I want to thank you for this invitation. All these dialogues are really fruitful for us. Former, I was responsible for labor politics in the state of Hessen. And Hessen has a partner state in the US, it's Wisconsin. And our Prime Minister, Roland Koch, visited Wisconsin and came back with ideas about workfare. And he told us, I want programs like they have in Wisconsin. And me and my department, we had a lot of work. And we made a total law about it, a new law for whole Germany. But at this time, we had a chancellor, a social democratic chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, and he organized Hessen is not allowed to do it like Wisconsin. But later, he took parts of this law, and it was his reform later. So what can we learn about? It's not important who does anything, but what happens after. You said it. You told about it. You invented some things, and other people worked further. And what means other people? Nobody of us works alone. And if about values and how don't we want these changes, we humans tend to the idea that migration today is a problem. Migration yesterday is natural. I am a migrant, you could say. Both of my parents haven't been born in Germany, but in Austria. But today, people look at me as a real biologic German. And so it goes on. In my neighborhood, one neighbor asked me something about other guys, and I told her, this happened, that happened. Oh, this must be foreigners. But the neighbor that asked this is Italian. We sold our row house to a Turkish family. And another neighbor said, oh, Turkish, horrible. She comes from India. So we think what we do in mixing is normal. But what now happens, or what may happen tomorrow, is a problem. We have in Frankfurt a comedian, a Turkish comedian, who likes to say, I envy these Italians how they dealt with their integration. They made the Germans too Italians. The first sunlight, and they sit on the street drinking latte macchiato. On the window sills, they have 3 sorts of basilico, and so on. So we change our identity, our personal identity, every day. And so do nations. And we have to look on how will it change, and it isn't bad. It brings life to it. Then, to make it short, you want us to talk about legal and structural barriers, education and employment on several levels. In 10 minutes it won't work, so I brought something written with me. I have only 10 or 12, so it isn't enough for anybody, but who won't get it, it's on the website too. We produced it not for you. Normally we write in German. It is because we are engaged in European exchange. And so we try to do some things in the English language. Rainer Gessler told you where Germany is located. Now we go to Europe, and you can see where the state of Hessen is located. It's in the middle of Germany, and it's in the middle of Europe. If you would have Europe and wanted to hold it, your fingertip would be in Hessen. We are the state with 6 million inhabitants, and 25% have immigration background. This is on the states, not the city-states, but the others, with Baden-Württemberg on the top. But more important is to look to the age brackets. We have not so much old people with immigration background, but children younger than 6, nearly every second has it. And that will be important at my end point. Remember it. There they come. You see, Turkey is the biggest part, Italy, and then when we had the World Soccer in Germany, and there were games in Hessen. We had no problems to find inhabitants. We invited inhabitants of all the countries that played. It was really easy to find such people. But we do integration policy because we have so much migrants. But we try to make a narrative to our society. We do it too because the state of Hessen has an international economy. We are on the top of all German states in attracting money from abroad. That means the Deutsche Bank isn't a Deutsche Bank. Which means the Frankfurt Fair is engaged in 100 places all over the world. The Frankfurt Flughafen, the airport, is half Antalya, and I don't know where everywhere they are engaged. Our state lives with internationality. And the manager from abroad doesn't like it if foreigners are not friendly, welcomed in this state. So we need integration policy, good policy for natural reasons. But Germany has a wonderful welfare system, still. And so it attracts not only well-educated people. This has consequences. We have people with poor language skills, with lower educational level, following lower employment. Turkish women are about employed at 30–35%. That is followed by an increased risk of poverty, makes a lack of integration, and there follows poor language skills, and so on. And we have to break this circle. I am lucky that I'm responsible for this field of policy since more than 15 years. So I had the chance to do some things on the long run with different politic parties responsible. And the first thing we did was a really big program, German in kindergarten. We changed the school law. We had special preschool classes and so on, and it had consequences. We have every year school beginners of 50,000 and 16,000 a year have these programs. And Rainer Gessler told about his topic, about he created a holistic approach. We call it integration mainstreaming.
This is Bernd.
Ah, I'm sorry.
No problem.
I'm sorry, I mixed it. We called it integration mainstreaming, meaning everybody in society has to work with us. We need the sport clubs for integration policy. We need all the municipalities. We need the foundations. Some really interesting things we could only do with foundations. But not in 10 minutes. I'll tell you later, if necessary. And the next point is, if you discuss about integration policy around Europe, everybody says it has to be bottom up. But we said, no, it's not enough. We need a top down. And all our programs we do, one condition is the mayor of a city and so on has to say, I want this to success. It is my challenge. Only then we give funding. I had the chance to do this 10 years ago for Germany. I was lucky I could be the architect for the German integration plan. And the idea was Angela Merkel shall say, I want to succeed it. And then she made their summits on integration and so on. On this, we force everybody who works with us. We make integration monitoring on the local level too. We force them, everybody work together, and we force them to give financial cooperation. When they do it, they are convinced in it. Lots of people talk about integration as a two-way process. I would say this was yesterday. It looks nice, it sounds nice, but it was yesterday because the receiving society is diverse already. And this changes what happens. And what we try to find and then remember on the age brackets, what Europe, what Germany do we want to have in the year 2030? This is we. This is Germany. This builds German ideas. And at the end you could say, what we try, as an American researcher lots of years ago, Philip Martin, wrote about Germany as a reluctant land of immigration. We have a lot of immigration, but we don't want. We learned now to want it and to deal with it, like the US do since a long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, last but not least, Cordula.
Yeah. We never talked before, but it's amazing how I will keep on and you will find things already from Ginnerman in my one documentation, because I'm now really here for the grassroots level. I'm a district in Berlin. Berlin has 12 districts. You see them here, all of them. It's very colorful, and it is a bit like a traffic light. You see the red light sounds for people which want to have success. Please don't go to the red light areas. It is not something about migration especially. It is more something connected to social challenges. That is always, everyone speak about migration, but the topic behind is social, like already indicated with lack of employment chances, lack of language skills, and further on. So these are just some keynotes to get an impression about what is Neukölln. Neukölln has two phases. One phase, it is in the German society, the city which stands for failed immigration policies in the past. The second phase is being a laboratory for finding solutions. So we have both, but we have to overcome our negative call to really go beyond it and not being stopped on the way to claim the past is always still there. So I would agree to, when people from Europe come and talk to me and say, how the Germans deal with all this, I say, who are here the Germans? I'm speaking about the intercultural challenge. We haven't this kind of being German anymore in Neukölln. It is a totally mixture, about second, third, and fourth generation. And the really challenged what happened as the war was coming down is that we lost a lot of working places. We lost about 20,000 employees which worked in the fabrication, so low qualified people, and they stayed without work. And that is a difficulty. That was the decline where Neukölln was moving down. As in the former times, in western parts, it was always a working district. It was not the high educated district, but it was a working district. and we lost work. So what I brought here today is an example how we try to communicate in a new way. It is, we have two new movements. One movement no one really noticed because it is so smooth and everyone liked this movement. It is the good educators, Spain, Greek, Italian people are moving as academics to Berlin and to Neukölln. They are often there without children and they find quick access to the housing market, to employees. So it's moving smooth. No one really noticed anyhow, and no one would really talk about migration in that way. But the second thing is poverty migration, the migration from Romanian and Bulgarian. And a lot of them are from the Roma minority. And the thing is, when you will characteristic how they are, with who is really coming there, a lot of families are coming again. From a Romanians living in Neukölln, 33% are under the age of 18. To compare, Polish, only 77%. So even Polish-like families too, but they are not having as much children as the Romanian people. So what I only want to show you, all the topics were already mentioned before. The two really necessary things that why I really wrote them down is structure accountability. Our mayor was the first who said this new migration, we want to stress it out. We don't want to look away again and let's see what will happen, but we really want to say this is something new and it won't stop if we will ignore this topic. The first thing is in Berlin Senate and on the German side, on the federal level, as we argued in the year 2011, they won't stay. They are used to traveling around in Europe. You will see they are soon away. We don't have to bother for our administration body or for our services or schools. And it is not like that. They are definitely staying. And we have a new growing community. They are already on the 5th level, already like on the same level like the Polish immigrants. And the second, mentioned already before in all our topics we are talking about, is the networking. We as administration and city council, we say we can do some things to support this. But we need still other stakeholders. We need the civil society. We need migration organizations. And they want to contribute. We have a new atmosphere of sharing responsibility. And that is maybe the thing that makes things dynamic, but is something more about moderation. It is not more that one has the solution. It is a thing of trying. And maybe some point where I want later on to, when we start the discussion, I only want to give you a simple example from the grassroots level, how obstacles are still existing, and sometimes the federal level can't notice them. Like when you want to study in Germany, you first have to make an examination called Abitur. And you have to have 2 languages, and it have to be languages which are confirmed to be qualified languages. Arab is not belonging to it as a qualified language. So we have a lot of Arab pupils speaking good mother tongue, speaking good German, good English, and they were maybe absolutely fantastic in mathematics, but they were not allowed to do the examination to be able to study later on. So that is a small law in the education part, what you have to change to allow these people, if their mother tongue has a quality like B2, that they're allowed to pass through to the examination and will be in the future students. So, but that have a result, because this missing acceptance of the mother tongue in administration or in the society is something that they feel still, after 20, 30 years of living together with us, misregarded and misrespected. That is the both ways. These are the hidden structures. And as we did it as model school in Neukölln, we did it apart from the normal school times. They do it in their free time to study it very well. And we open up the courses too for the parents, because the parents never could speak quite good mother tongue too. And that changed something, because they feel more welcomed in this way. So it's a process of both. We don't have to say each teacher must now speak Arab and Turkish too, but the chance of both ways is necessary. And this some of my, as I thought about today and from the grassroots level, what I think of is, yeah, everywhere, everyone knows Germany is an immigration country. It is in the head, the word is out, but is it really in the blood? Is really everyone behaving in his way to support this aim? And I feel that more and more from the local level especially are aware that it is necessary to do something quick. And we have a complicated federal system, and changes to support take a look of time. The new partner is here really the civil society, who wants to build up the welcome structure, even especially when we talk about the refugee topic. Then there is a lot of activities that comes really from the bottom-down process, which really brings a lot of. And the companies, they see a lack of qualified persons. They really want it, and they are coming more in this discussion up and raise their word. Like we have this discussion, we talked in Neukölln, there's a lot of poverty, migration. The Chamber of Commerce will say, no, 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 in the average they are higher qualified than the Germans in the moment. But we again said the average is not existing in Berlin. It is not feasible, it's not touchable. It is something, it is the average. But under this both sides, it is more diverse dialogue. It's not just painted by the wall, that it is all negative. The second parallel discussion, what is very interesting is that the second and third generation build up their own associations. They don't want to stay in their cultural heritage and do their cultural associations. They are saying proactive, we are Germans and we want to create. And if they are not the official way, if it's still too hard to climb the ladder, we do it on a side way, and we do networks to have really further or later more power to influence the society. So that's for my thanks.
We have a good amount of time for discussion. If people could identify themselves, please, we'd be very grateful. Basil? Oh, sorry.
I'm Basil Scarless. I have lived in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. I have a question regarding two aspects. One is that the programs in various German communities, you mentioned the importance of integrating immigrants and then the school system, but what about childcare? Is childcare seen as a way to integrate? And you would think this would also make it easier to undertake employment. If you're in a poor community, you have to have some way of caring for your children. And then the second question is somewhat different, but did the educational requirement for university education change? That is, does the system still require 2 languages other than German? And not your native Arab, for example.
Well, the first thing is We have in the biggest community of people that migrated to Germany, the Turkish people. They have a tradition to have children in the family. And then the last year in the kindergarten, and then they have to learn German. They are in the Turkish family, they speak Turkish, they look Turkish television. And then for the last year, kindergarten, and then society has to do the rest. But we had a chance to transform it a little bit. You can find here some data too about how families with immigration background use the system of kindergarten and other instruments where they can bring their children. And the same was the discussion about German language for these children. When we started it, now 14 years ago, we had a big discussion in the German community, like this would be a torture, training them German. Or that's forced Germanization. You have to teach them, the German children, the Turkish language too. It has to be multilingual, otherwise it's not politically correct. And on these discussions, I remember very well 12, 13, 14 years ago when I answered, how shall we manage multilingual education in kindergarten when we have in only our state of Hessen 150 origin languages? Oh, don't be so practical, it's a question of ideology. You don't have to force them to learn German. But we had the idea, not German is the most beautiful language in the world. I would choose maybe Italian for this, but it's the language of this economic region. And these children need it for better performing in the school. And the parents of these children understood. And we started it, and the children, I told you we changed the school law. Former, a child was brought to a school for being angemeldet? Registered with 5.5 years. For half a year later, going to school. We changed it to 4.5. And in this first contact, the teacher could see, is this child able to call this a table, this a glass, or not? And if not, they could say, oh, you give a chance, 1 year intensive German. And it worked very well. And there have been some more changes. And it worked very well even for the consciousness of what is important for the children. Next point, especially for the Turkish community, we have a situation, the German basic law defines the Holy Family. You are not allowed to destruct family. So if someone is married with a Turkish woman, this woman has the right to come to Germany. The community transformed it to marriage migration. Marriage with the goal to have migration. And thus brings us in the situation we have always a new first generation. Mostly young women from Eastern Turkey, low educated, get married to come to Germany. So we have again and again to work with it, but it works, difficult, but it works. And now we have the chance that Germany attracts other people too, from Syria, from Iraq. And this mixing, the more diverse it is, just the better it works for the German community. And the second language, the second question was?
Relating to university access for
Oh.
children who have this problem. They have English but Arabic doesn't count.
We changed some little things. The pupils had the chance to get their mother language in their exams if it had a defined quality. And it counted in the exams. I'm not so...
they use it.
They use it.
They use it.
A
And-
defined quality being a research language, a major language.
Oh, mostly it's the origin language, and they get tested if it has a defined quality, and if it has this quality, it's worthy in the exams. And what we changed too is if a language is required as second foreign language, it can be added to what we have normally as English, French, Old Greek, Latin, but there can come Turkish, there can come Russian, if it is enough required. So this gets a normal second foreign language.
Cordula, do you have something to say about Berlin books?
We changed it too, and the educational system is on the countries side. As the 16 countries is on the, you have the federal, the state, and the community. So that is changed by the federal. By the countries,
by the states.
by the states.
And in Detroit?
Well, in Detroit, so it plays out a little bit differently in terms of language. We don't have an official language, although many people think English is our official language. How I would say programming is often pushed English as a second. You have programs to not true bilingual programs. So what you find happening is that students who may speak Arabic or in English or Spanish and English end up being illiterate in both languages because when they come to the school system, not being able to speak English fluently, they're not taught in their native language, and English is the only form of instruction, yet they're not able to grasp the concepts because of the language barriers, but they're not being taught in their native language, so they're struggling in both languages, and that actually happens pretty frequently, that you see people graduating from high school who are functioning illiterate in both their native language as well as their second language. And so and I would say as a nation, we really tend to push English only or English as a second language versus true bilingual programs or true immersion programs, which that you would teach them in multiple languages and they're able to adapt those skills. And so it's still a problem, I would say.
And do you have programs that try to
We do
address
have
it?
programs similar. So many of the elementary schools, similar to the demographics in Germany and Berlin and Hessen, large populations of kids under 18, elementary school students. So now the schools are starting to create literacy programs and educational programs for the parents. So parents can get their high school diplomas, so they can improve their reading and writing in their native language as well as English. And then daycare is coupled with that. So oftentimes you have a migrant family that may have 3 or 4 kids. One is in 3rd grade, one's in 6th grade, and then they may have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. And so they're not able to attend those classes because they need to care for their kids. So the schools are creating daycares so the parents can leave their kids there, and then classes within the school. So when they're done with their programming, they pick up their kids from the daycare, they pick up their kids from the elementary school, and then go home to provide wraparound services.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Thank you, Robert Hunter from the Center for Transatlantic Relations, another part of this megalopolis called SAIS. First, congratulations to people who organized this, because I think this interchange of experience is extraordinarily important. I wanted to ask a little bit about the experience that one is having in terms of what I'd call cultural identity. I know this gets into the PC problem, but particularly in Europe, as opposed to, quote, in the United States, where we talk about a melting pot, whether it's real or not, it's another matter. There's obviously a lot of pushback. Certainly a lot of pushback in France and some other places. Certainly a lot of tension over people who come from Muslim countries, in part because the media has totally hyped a relatively minuscule terrorist actuality in all of our countries. And I was wondering how you're fitting this in Germany as you struggle to continue to create a thing called Germany and have it evolve, but having people coming from abroad. I know it was basically in Berlin, the Turkish question. There's still a question of, is there a Berlin Wall of the mind, even with the people from East Germany? Have they been fully integrated? I'm also delighted to hear about Detroit. That's the best, your presentation is the best news about Detroit I've heard in an awful long time. But I was wondering as well whether there are, I'm going to use a terrible word, I'm talking about cultural integration issues in Detroit and coping with those so that people will define themselves, quote, as American, Michiganders and people from Detroit, rather than compartmentalized into something with hyphens connected to it.
Sure, I can start. That's a really interesting question. And so I have two colleagues in Berlin, actually. One is another elected official in Tempelhof-Schönenberg who is a Turkish immigrant. And so oftentimes we have these conversations about what it means to be American, what it means to be German. And what an interesting question I asked, I said, so are you German-Turkish or are you Turkish-German? Because I'm Mexican-American. That's how I'm identified on the little checklist. And he's like, no, I am German-Turkish, and I thought it was interesting it wasn't Turkish-German, whereas in the States, your other identity is kind of put first. But I would say we're at a different phase, right? We are a country founded by immigrants, whether we acknowledge that or not. But there still is this sense of certain groups of people in our country that have a perpetual immigrant status. And I would say that's often ascribed to Latinos as well as Asians in our country. That if you come from one of these cultures, you frequently are asked, where are you from? And I think are made to feel, or you feel, then interpret that as being un-American. So I can speak from my personal experience and then briefly my colleagues that are in Berlin and some of the experiences that they've had. So I'm an elected official. I think I've made it very much. I'm a part of our society. And I work with immigrants from different communities, as well as Detroiters and U.S. citizens who are born and raised in the city. But as I said before, the city is incredibly segregated. And the dynamics play out a little bit differently in the city of Detroit because, as I stated, it's a majority-minority city, primarily African-American. So to a certain extent, I'm on council. I was born and raised in Detroit, but I often get asked, when did you come to Detroit? When did your parents come to this country? And I say, I was born and raised here, and people still question, similar to our president, my birth certificate status. And so just the other day, I was actually at a major policy conference for the state of Michigan, and a gentleman asked me where I was from, and I told him Detroit, and he said, no, where are you really from? And I said, really, Henry Ford Hospital, Detroit, Michigan. And he said, no, where's your heritage? And I didn't ask him, and sometimes I get really annoyed, other times I don't. Sometimes I want to say, oh, well, where are you really, really from? Like way back. And so he said, oh, and I said, oh, well, my family migrated from Mexico. And I'm very proud to be Mexican and to have those roots and to know that, because there's some people that don't necessarily know where their families, their heritage come from. So I never tried to deny that aspect, but it's the question when you're asked that and you answer and you're not given legitimacy. If I say I'm from Detroit, Michigan, why is that not a legitimate answer? And so it's this underlying, I think, perception of what it means to be a Michigander, what it means to look like a Detroiter, and to a lot of people that means African American, what it means to be a U.S. citizen, often that means Caucasian, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. So when I travel abroad, it's interesting, when I I went to Venezuela when I was in high school. That was the very first time I can remember in my life when I was called, you're an American. No, you're from the United States, you're an American. And I thought it was so interesting because growing up in the United States, I had never been asked or been told, no, you're an American. It's, oh, you're Mexican. Oh, you're a Mexican American, or whatever other country they imagine me from being from. So it is an interesting dynamic to deal with, even as an adult, and to be asked that question pretty frequently about where I'm from and what that means. And I like to, and so my my colleagues that are in Germany that are Turkish immigrants, and one is an elected official, another does immigration integration work with schools and the workforce of feeling both very German, right, and very American, and that this dual identity is something that's unique to our country, and I would say maybe unique to Germany as well, and that there is so many immigrant groups there. But it's for me, I say we're the new Americans, right? We're a country founded by immigrants, and just as maybe as the Irish were ostracized before and now embraced, the Italians were ostracized and now embraced. We're always in transition in terms of what our identity looks like. And oftentimes I think we think of culture as being stagnant, and this is what it looks like to be Latino, this is what it looks like to be whatever the other group is, but they're always fluid, and so that can change from generation to generation over time. And so I am American, and I recognize that, but it has been a struggle, I would have to say, personally and professionally, in terms of feeling American. But I think it's a new identity as the immigrant community grows in the country, or continues to grow, and a different group grows, as to what that means. And again, I have limited experience of being in Berlin and speaking with Turkish immigrants and people who are second generation, third generation, is feeling German, but also feeling very un-German because of their Muslim background, or because of their skin color or their accent that they speak with. So I think it is still definitely a very real challenge, but it's important to have these types of conversations.
Walter?
Some years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I had the chance to engage new people in my department. And we had written this in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, in die Zeit, and it were more than 500 academics who wanted to work with us. And we don't make positive discrimination, but we looked with a friendly way on it. And in the following time, I have one colleague, the father is from Ghana, one colleague, both parents are from Morocco, really from Iran, from Kazakhstan, from Afghanistan, from Turkey, and so on. Very well-educated people. Journalists recognized what we did. And one journalist came and, I want to have interviews with your department. Okay, he could come. He came and said, oh, I only want to talk with your migrants. Okay, we accepted it. And there were the young people with migration background for the discussion. And after some minutes, my colleague, where the father comes from Ghana, said, what a fuss. I am German. And this is what we want. But we don't have success in every point. Because the Turkish population asked me after it, but you don't have enough Germans. We are more. So you should have more Turkish. We said, we had to choose about qualification. And this is a point. The Turkish population in Germany is really big. And they have a president in Ankara who comes to Germany and says, you are my people and you will stay my people. And some of the Turkish people want to transform to Germans, and others want to build a little Turkey in Germany. And so we have to deal with this problem. And I set my hopes on the third, the fourth, the fifth generation. But at this point, Germany has a problem. Because of Nazism, Second World War, if we talk about German values, the normal German says, oh, excuse me that I'm here, and then I have some feelings about our culture. Please excuse. We only can integrate if we are conscious who we are, and if we tell it. We try the way, one of the articles you have here is about Islamic religious courses in school. We were very engaged to realize it, but we are very engaged to realize it by the normal rules of our basic law. No special rules. We have to give the opportunities to live this culture, to live the Islamic religion, but by the rules. And this is a problem where we have some fightings in the public discussions. Not everybody of us is strong enough to say they should have all the chances, but by the rules. And there we have to do a little bit. And it's a cultural question too. If you would have asked the German population, do you want to have Islamic immigration? The population would have answered no. It came 60 years ago because workers from Turkey have been cheaper than workers from Portugal. And because the United States were interested in Turkey in the NATO, and so on. It was not, and for this first point where we engaged Turkish workers for Germany, the responsible ministry for work refused to organize it. It has been made by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs to be friendly to the interests of US. Otherwise, we wouldn't have so much Turkish people. And this culture tradition we have anywhere. A young German intellectual goes in an Italian restaurant, and surely he doesn't order gnocchi, but gnocchi. If you think you are well educated, you can ask and use maybe at least 12 Italian words. But you can find television speakers who are not able to pronounce the name Erdogan correctly. It is not so highly estimated to know some Turkish words, but I'm sure it will change. 20 years later, it will work.
And it's a bit a trap that the one with a good migration academic backgrounds, they always have to do this migration topic. So that is, we have politicians now with background, but they are often in the field of handling migration. And I mean, sorry, but they could be great mathematics or anything. Society never recognized them in their topic, but they should be just common because they are born different or have different roots, being specialists in migration topics. That is a bit the trap of it. And that's why sometimes the parallel system move on, like a good academic being lawyer, Turkish background, have nothing to do with anyhow with a totally Turkish community living in Berlin. But as he thought, okay, what I should do, I'm not as good as to go to the government to work there. Okay, they are there's my community, maybe they come as client. And yeah, they come. And a German would not choose a Turkish lawyer with a name, or the same with a doctor. So we have some fundamentalism rules which are creating it maybe over the next generation. And to overcome this is not an easy thing.
And the Turkish population is not homogeneous. When I was in Turkey, Turkish people told me, oh, you Germans don't want us in the European Union because you have the wrong Turkish people in Germany. Yeah? One of my married relatives is a Turkish man. He's a nuclear medicine expert. He formerly came from Istanbul. It's normal. One of my friends works with our FBI, BKA in Germany. Nobody sees him as a Turkey, as a Turkish people. They are integrated. But most Turkish people that came to Germany come from Eastern Anatolia. And they need more time to achieve in this modern society. That we have to understand. We ask these people to work with us for really simple work in the coal mines, in the car industries, and so on. They had to do the simplest work we Germans didn't want to do anymore. And their children now have to achieve in a modern society. It takes a little bit of time, but I'm sure they will do it.
And if I could just add really quick, I think similar to the diversity of the Turkish population, when we say Latino in the United States, that's over 20 countries. And so we kind of create this homogenous identity and assume that everyone is Mexican. But that identity in of itself was created by the US government. And so to be Puerto Rican, to be Cuban, to be Colombian is all very different. So people are coming with these national identities at the forefront and then all of a sudden being put in this group to be Latino. And what does that mean? And that is very, very different. And so racism plays into that as well, and that lighter skinned Latinos are treated and usually more integrated than the browner or the African looking Latinos that come to the United States. And so I think partially is the educational background that they come to the United States with, because that's, although we say we want high-skilled workers, I think that's what sounds more politically correct and more sexy. But for Michigan, the state of Michigan, we are in desperate need of agricultural workers, which more commonly called farm workers. We're the second biggest agricultural industry in the country, and we are short on agricultural workers. Now, we would view that as unskilled, but I personally cannot stand and pick raspberries every single day for 8 hours. That is a skill. And so, but we devalue certain professions and attribute that to certain groups that come from certain countries. But we need both these quote-unquote low-skilled workers as well as the high-skilled workers. And I would view not just that high-skilled are integrated because they are part of our economic institutions or academia. The job, that I don't know if that's a symbol of true integration and that the unskilled are not integrated. It's recognizing why we are attracting people to our country and being very honest about that conversation around how we modify our services to meet the needs of the people that we are either sometimes pushing with our foreign policy into our country or are opening our arms to bring to our country. So, thank you.
Thank you. I see at least 2 questions.
Yeah.
This lady
yes.
and then the gentleman here and the lady here.
Yes, Rita Rowan, George Mason University. I am the daughter of German immigrants who came to America, so this is all very interesting. And you all spoke to some extent about the self-identity of the immigrants. And a few years ago, I went to Berlin for a Fulbright program. And one of the things we learned is that as many programs as you can create for immigrants and that they participate in, if they don't have an image themselves of who they are, then there's a lot of confusing ideas about their goals and how they can achieve them. And so the Fulbright program has a specialized program from Germany that's only for the children of immigrants. And they are sent to, for example, University of Kentucky, a very just Americana kind of American university. And it's only then when they get there and they start talking, just like Raquel said, when you go outside of the region you're in and you start to tell people about yourself, that they start to feel comfortable saying, I'm German. They're not saying I'm Turkish or from Turkish parents, they're just saying I'm German. And so I'm wondering if you have other programs that help with self-awareness and self-identity of immigrant children to help them actualize and be comfortable with their sort of new situation.
We have one really successful program. It's called Starting. I mentioned the foundations. It is made by the Hertie Foundation. They have lots of money. And I can't do it because it is not fair to give only a young person money only because it has migrant parents. This program had two goals. First, showing the Germans, well-educated young people, showing this is a migrant too, and to give them chances. This program gives young people between 15 and 18, you would say college years, €100 a month, modern computer equipment, connecting all of them, and education, going to a parliament, training in how give I a speech, and all of this. We started this in the state of Hessen, now 14 years ago. Today it works in every state in Germany, in Switzerland, in Austria, and now it started in Brussels. On this model, young people, immigration background, socially engaged, and the parents should be not wealthy. This is difficult. And good in school. It's a wonderful program because for this topic you can show the community, these are migrants, look at these opportunities here. And people can see it. And now it worked some years. These young people make new programs. One program these young people do is integrator. They go in schools and tell young children with immigration background, look what I managed. Today I'm studying medicine. Today you have the chance too. You have to do these things and then you can manage it. And these things work. They work to both sides. And that's what we need. And not to complain about what doesn't work, but to see what works. When we talk with journalists about how migrants feel and think, what we really researched, the journalists say, this is impossible because we don't write other things. And journalists talk about migrants and they see one special problematic group. But the migrants in total are more identified with German society than you would believe when you read a newspaper. And we have one example. In one research we asked the people with and without migration background, do you think that this society does enough for integration? 2 of 3 said yes. The difference between people with and without migration background was 4%. And then we asked, do you think migrants do enough for their integration? 2 of 3 said no. And the difference between people with and without migration background was again 4 or 5%. So we are more close than we think.
I only want to mention something because in the average, I think we did already good thing and we learned lessons. But we still have an accumulation always in special areas, not totally around Germany, but special areas. Like now we have new refugees from Syria. They come, they introduce the children to school and they say where you want to go to school. So if they come with a good qualification, they don't want to go in the northern part of Neukölln, where we have a high Arabic and Turkish community. They are already so clever, just freshly arrived. They say, no, we want our child to go to the higher place because she should study later on in the south part. She should be together with Germans. I mean, there are 50% there are still Germans, but not as many as in another place. So we got not a migrant thing, but we get segregation of special groups of society. And this is something that, because of the accumulation of the challenges, that is really something hard to change.
The engaged part of the Turkish population, lots of them asked us, the government, couldn't you do something like the US with busing? Because I don't want, the Turkish people, my children to have in a school where are so much Turkish pupils. I want my children to have.
Oh, I can comment, I guess, on the busing issue. I mean, it's similar, right? I think, again, as I said earlier about it changes, the perception of immigration changes. So LA is a good example, large immigrant community. I mean, you have Asians, you have Latinos, you have people from Caribbean background. And so what's interesting is that the most recent arrivals live in the heart of the city, in the poorer areas, maybe East LA, and the generations that have been here for 2-3 generations live on the outer side. And so you see the discrimination, although they may be Latino, a Mexican, fourth generation versus Mexican just came over in between the two, and it really becomes this kind of class discrimination as well as I think discrimination based on the educational level of attainment. But I would say in terms of education and in general, I'm not a fan of big busing systems because any community, immigrant or not immigrant, should have access to quality education within their neighborhoods that families can walk to or drive to in a very short distance. And so busing to other areas may address that need for that family, but doesn't address the need for the surrounding community. So how do you look comprehensively at our education systems within cities to say, okay, this is the perception because there's more Turkish immigrants there or because there's more Latino immigrants there. But how do you then change the perception to make so that everyone knows that this is a desirable school that is providing quality education despite them having this type of immigrant community there, and really viewing that immigrant community then as an asset. So it's great, they have 50% Latinos, a wonderful quality education. That's where I want to send my kids because this is the type of culture they're going to be exposed to. So shifting the perception of what's valued and what's not valued.
Dale Medeiros, Northern Virginia Regional Commission, and I have a practical question that involves youth soccer in my city. I have a colleague whose daughter plays with mine. He's half German, half Guatemalan, and he's been asked by the soccer league to reach out to bring in young girls into the club. Some context, the city of Alexandria is extremely diverse. Our region, if I'm not mistaken, Mark or Bob, is second to New York in terms of diversity measured by languages spoken at home. And there is a real problem reaching out to the South Asian, the Hispanic, the children of the African community. What's interesting is that on the men's side, it's a mini United Nations on the soccer field. It reflects, I think, the transition or the equivalent process that we see with men's soccer, for instance, in Germany, Boateng, Özil. 10 years ago, Özil would have played for the Turkish team. Now Gundogan, this whole generation is feeling German, as you said. It's the same with the American soccer team. It's very diverse, very multicultural. Watching the Women's World Cup team last night, the US play Australia, I was struck by the Australian team actually with a very diverse demographic. Women's soccer in the United States tends to be primarily white and upper middle class. So what words of advice do you have? And this is directed to all of you, but I guess especially to Mrs. Castañeda Lopez. Mm-hmm. What advice do you have for the language that my colleague needs to use in this process of recruiting? Because there is a stigma, there's a cultural barrier. The girls are not allowed in many respects by their families to go out and play soccer.
Not only this. I have a second example. It's, Germany has a system of voluntary fire brigades. 15 years ago, it was discussed as the last homogeneous German bastion in the society. Only Germans. You have to look behind. And if you look behind, you recognize that voluntary work normally is a middle-class work. And if you have immigrants less in the middle class, they won't find to this. The second is, in Turkey, voluntary fire brigade is military, and they don't want it. So you have to go at all these points. And similar, soccer for girls. You have some parents that if you look close, what happens there? Oh no, I don't want that my daughter changes her clothes and the door to the boys' room is so near they can look through the door. You have to look at these little things, and maybe if you change them, it can work. And lots of us had, just on this topic, girls in soccer, we engaged us a lot because it's a question of paradigm. If we make this possible, we can change more. Or, for example, we made a program where women could make a degree in trainer for sports. The first stadium was going in the mosque, inviting the men, convincing the men to allow their women to do this. Therefore, in the mosque, and what happened in the mosque? The women were happy that they have been together with other women, and they learned this sport training qualification, and then they trained. They could train girls, and so on. It's a hard work. But not only you need a narrative, but you need to look really on the details and finding out which details really are a problem.
And I think that's a question that Dale had to repair.
Sure. I mean,
what advice would you give?
I would echo, because I think oftentimes we apply as well, the culture doesn't allow women to participate, and I don't think that's really the case. It's small things that you can change. So for example, I did coach soccer, and there were so few women coaches. So, and I coached little kids, and so the girls would play until they were about, I think, 8 years old, and then they would kind of drop off. So there was interest when they were younger that the parents wanted to get the girls involved, but to a certain extent there wasn't the same support for the girls being involved. So if the girl fell down, the parents would be like, it's okay, you don't have to play anymore. If it was a boy that fell down, keep going, that's how you should play, right? So just think of how we acculturate men and women in our society. So I think one is starting making sure that you have female coaches, as he stated, right? He had the male member of the mosque go and introduce this to the mosque. Who's kind of the gatekeeper for the community? So identifying whether they're parent leaders at school or church leaders, who will provide you access to that community to share this resource is key, and identifying who are the key leaders in that community for that population specifically, for women specifically. And then this is just my circumstance, my situation. If I knew that after 8 years old, the girls started dropping out, what was the reason for them to drop out? And it was oftentimes because then the boys had travel teams, but there were no girls' travel teams. So the girls didn't really have more options to pursue. So rather than we create a girls' travel team. And again, making sure to recruit female coaches for the girls to establish those relationships with parents. But
coaches of the same ethnic or demographic background?
I think if you're targeting women, it's women, making sure that you have women. I think if there's language barriers, obviously someone that has cultural sensitivity and is familiar with working with those families. So I speak Spanish, and many of my parents, they spoke Spanish, so we were able to communicate. If the coaches that didn't speak Spanish did struggle a little bit more. But ultimately, I think if you're committed to making sure that they have a good experience playing soccer, whether they could speak English or not, it often created fun dynamics, because they would say, I want you to run, and they said, I want you to eat, and the parents would all laugh at the coach because they didn't know what they were saying, right? Mm-hmm. So you'll get over the language barriers, you'll figure out how to communicate. But if it's to increase the participation of a specific gender, I would say, yeah, it's important to have female coaches. It's important to reach out to community leaders to get access and to share that information. But it takes time to build those relationships. But starting at a very early level as well, and making sure that both groups have access to equal opportunities. If only boys have fun travel teams and girls they kind of only stay on one field, they may lose interest over time. But I would say in general, for many immigrant communities, even within the Arab community, and we've worked with some African refugees where women don't play soccer either, when you created a safe space for them to participate, even adults, they had the greatest time participating in sports. But it was building those relationships, creating a safe space for them to participate, and so it's not seen in a threatening manner. And then making sure that people that look like them in some form, whether it's that they are Latino or they are women, to kind of serve as role models. And so I'm a big advocate of getting women in the fire department and police department. I was a firefighter when I was in college. No one believes me. I was a wildland firefighter in Montana, and I tell people and they think, oh my goodness. But when I go to speak to firefighters, I tell them my story of being a firefighter, and I'm going to do the exam, the physical exam, and to share with people so that you know that that's something that's possible for you. So it's kind of breaking down those stereotypes. Yeah.
We have two people who've been very patient, but if I could ask you to just briefly pose your question or comment and do it one after the other, and then give you a chance to just briefly, because we're between lunch and the next session. So please go ahead.
Sure. My name is Devin Horn. I'm from Georgetown University. My question is just, do you see housing policy as an option to promote greater diversity among neighborhoods for immigrants and beyond, really? This is a problem that extends beyond immigration policy.
And this lady.
Hi, I'm Ann Go from the U.S. Department of Commerce. I was struck by your comment, Ms. Simon, about the segregation. Certain topics are relegated to the immigrant professionals. The previous panel, we talked about smart cities, and we have German cities and U.S. cities talking about all these wonderful things. This particular panel, I feel like I'm in a different world altogether. And then in Detroit, you mentioned that you want to provide city services to legal and illegal immigrants alike, but yet at a certain age, those people that you provide services to and you educate, they have to be deported. And so all the data that you've collected on their city services, on their identity card, I want to tie it to smart cities, because data collection on citizens, their mobility, their location, their activities, that's a big thing for cities. So how do you manage to provide services to all your citizens, immigrants or not? And secondly, what do you do with the data, and how do you manage that when you have to deal with law enforcement on the immigration status?
Sure. Do you want me to go? So really quickly, housing policy, I think, has super important in terms of integration in general, whether it's upper class, lower class, highly educated, lower educated, whatever you think of bringing diverse groups together, it plays a huge role. And I think we struggle with that as a country. And so affordable housing or low-income housing has a very negative stigma, and the types of people that live there often are people of color or newly arrived immigrant communities. So how do we move beyond that? And oftentimes when we talk about integrated housing, we talk about bringing in wealthy people into low-income communities. And when I say, well, a really truly integrated housing is having, if you have 100% market rate, maybe you make 20% of that affordable housing, and vice versa. If you have 100% low income, maybe you make that 20% marketable. That goes both ways, and people gasp, that's the worst idea in the world, and it's going to destroy our economy and all of our neighborhoods. But it needs to be that conversation around what do diverse communities look like, and not even just in terms of class or educational, but in family structures. So no longer do we have the same kind of nuclear family structure where 2 parents and 2 kids. There's lots of different family structures. And so how do you build housing that's conducive to attracting seniors, to attracting families with young kids, to attracting young professionals who just want a loft, to attracting the newly arrived immigrant that may come and live with their aunt and uncle and their grandmother. So really being conscious in the actual physical layout of what our buildings look like, what our housing structures look like, so that they create a public space where people can interact and engage. Oftentimes, I think we design our cities and we design our housing in terms of functionality This will provide us the greatest amount of light. That's awesome. We want lights in our buildings, but not at the expense of creating kind of apartments that are siloed where people don't really interact with each other. So I think it goes down to, we call it placemaking a lot in the States. I think it's really the physical infrastructure and layout of our communities and cities, and housing in particular, even how an apartment is laid out to promote community and dialogue. In terms of collecting data, we're at the very beginning phase. By no means do we have tons of data in the city of Detroit on our immigrant communities. But the data that we do have from nonprofits and foundations, I mean, it's not necessarily, it's moving away from asking people their immigration services. Some services you need their immigration status. Some services you need to know that as to whether you can provide them services or not. But it's kind of if the question doesn't need to be asked, what's the relevancy? If you as a family are looking for a school to send your child, there's no need for me to know what your immigration status is. It's how old is your child? What might be their learning difficulties, and okay, then how do we fit you someplace based on that? So the data that we collect is much more focused on what city services do you usually access, how is your experience in terms of, are people polite, do they speak other languages, do they offer you information, and then tweaking how we deliver city services based really much more on a customer service and appreciation approach versus this is where you come from. I mean, that's difficult in certain areas. For example, our Secretary of State does not allow undocumented immigrants to get a driver's license. And that they enforce that a little bit more strictly than in some other states. So that creates, obviously, barriers if people have an expired ID and they can't access other types of services. But for us, it's creating a baseline data in terms of what are the true demographics of our existing immigrant communities, and what are their needs, and looking at it much more from a needs approach. And then obviously we have to be compliant with the law, correct? But I would say there is collaboration with Immigration Customs Enforcement and Border Patrol and the state, as well as the county and the city, in terms of how we can best service our immigrant communities, both undocumented as well as documented. But that's not how we approach the conversation. Yeah.
Walter, just quickly.
Just quickly, about the point data. First, how access to institutions, and the next question of data. Migrants don't have the same access to helping institutions, health system, and so on, as normal German population. But, for example, that's the reason of social class. When I worked, my first work as psychologist was in a counseling institution in education, children and family problems. The institution was located in Berlin, in a region where poor people lived, and it came the middle class people from other regions. That's one point. The second point is collecting data. We try to do it. We try to do integration monitoring and so on. But when we now try to collect data about the intercultural opening of administrations and so on, it's complicated because Germany has a strong law on secure data. I am not allowed to ask an employee if he is a migrant because it has to be a secure data. I can only allowed to ask them voluntarily, and then answer 36%, and I don't know what is with the 64% which didn't answer. It's crazy. We have a really strong law. It's crazy because NSA knows anything about us. But we have it. So we are not allowed to ask things that would be very interesting for integration policy.
Yeah.
Final word.
Two mentionings and two remarks. We have a diverse housing projects over generations sometimes. Sometimes about different nationalities together, but that is one single house there or there. It's not just a creation or planning of a whole district or anything. That is not working through because we have strong rights what his landlord could do with his property. And the second thing why we see there the difference between the first panel, I observed too. That is it, because the intention is different. The intention of German was in the past years, as we hired the Turkish, different, as we gave the first asylum seekers and refugees hospitality. We thought they go back too, so there was a lake too. And I feel there's a big difference to the States, because who wants to go to the States want to make his living, and often he's not looking too much back, maybe only for the families. But the Turkish, they bought land and still they think they go back. And that is a difference in it.
Let me thank you, all three of you, for your very rich insights. And I think there's more discussion that you would like to have, has to be over lunch. And all of you for your excellent questions and comments. Please eat quickly and come back at 1 o'clock. But thank you.
Thank you so much.